That was the rest of the class, though. Oh, so yeah. It's just that there's so much.
Thank you. I had a bunch of experience so far. And I go to yeah, I think the one is like
First class once because I'm in the 21.
I'm taking this like
22. Yeah, you can solve it.
wait. Bro,
All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Guess our first time meeting in person. So how's everyone doing today? Good to see everybody. So we have a little technical issues today. So apparently the Zoom is not updated on this computer. And so I am connected to Zoom on my iPad, and then in person I have the slides here. So can everyone on Zoom hear me okay? Okay, good. Okay, yeah, so we'll do this today. I'll contact IT. Maybe they'll fix it in like 3 weeks or something like that. But you know, so at least we figured a workaround for now. Okay, so today I have a set of lecture slides today. I don't think it's going to take the whole time. But you know, because this is a biomechanics class, you know, before we start really talking about any kind of biomechanics, we have to learn the terminology. And so if we go back a slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about skeletal and muscle anatomy, right? So this is probably going to be the most bio-focused lecture that we'll have in the class today, just because, you know, we need to know the names of all the different parts of the body, all the different bones and the muscles, you know, before we really start going, okay? And so, you know, I'm going to try to do kind of 2 slides at the same time. So let me start today by saying that, you know, there's going to be a lot of terminology today, a lot of vocabulary. You know, I don't expect you to know or memorize everything at the end of the day. That honestly, that would be kind of madness. But I at least kind of want to almost kind of like flash expose you guys to all of these different terms. And then kind of what my expectation is throughout the semester as we go through kind of more specialized topics. You know, when you hear a term, you're like, okay, you know, I'll let me go back to this set of lecture slides. So, you know, I recommend that you download all the lecture notes, but the one that I recommend you download the most is this one. You know, because we'll be referring to it again and again throughout the semester. Okay, and so we're going to go over a lot of terms, a lot of vocabulary today. But you know, just try to absorb as much as you can, and just know that we'll be revisiting this throughout the semester. Okay. Okay. All right. Another announcement. So I took a look at the wait list today. So I think there are 3 people on the wait list. And so that would put, I do want to accept everyone. And so that would put the class size about 38. And so I just looked at the room capacity for this room. It's actually only 36. And so I am going to request a bigger room so that we can all be here together, so that everyone can be in. Although, you know, if people drop on their own by Friday and it ends up being 36, then I won't. But you know, I'll at least ask the department, see if there's any bigger rooms available at this time. Okay. But if you're on the wait list, you know, don't worry about it. You know, I'll do everything I can to get you into the class. Okay. All right. Any questions that I can answer before we get started for today? Okay. All right. I have to remember to kind of check on Zoom, just because it's I don't think it shows me the chat on a regular basis. Chat. Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So what is anatomy? And so anatomy is probably a term that you've heard before, you know, maybe in a biology class you took in high school or something, or maybe you took a bio class here. But anatomy is just simply names, right? And so it's just the vocabulary of describing, you know, in our case, the human body, but in general, it's just any kind of, you know, animal body, stuff like that, okay? And so it's the names of all the parts, the bones, the muscles, the joints, the different regions of the body, and a lot of other corresponding terms that help you describe, you know, the body itself, okay? And so in order to study biomechanics, you know, we need to know the correct terminology. And so, you know, as engineers, you know, up to this point, we've learned a lot of the technical kind of engineering terms, but in order to correctly apply, you know, to the human body, we have to know the names of stuff, right? That's kind of the first step. And so I will say that, you know, the terminology, it is a little bit intimidating, especially when you first see it. You know, some of the words are kind of very long, but also just the amount of volume of the terms that we're going to see is very large. And so, you know, it's going to take time, it's going to take practice. And so this is not something that, you know, I expect you all to really walk out this door and memorize it all at once. And even in this lecture, you know, I don't go in 100% detail of everything. We'll save that for kind of later. But just know that this is going to take some time, okay? And just like I mentioned, you know, I highly recommend that you kind of have these set of lecture notes on hand. Not only do they have all the really important terms, but just the figures that go along with them are really helpful just for kind of visualizing to see what they're doing. And again, you know, we're just going to do a quick overview and not really get into the details. Okay, so let's start with the different regions of the body. And so I call this gross or whole body modeling, okay? And so I would say the most common way to kind of break down the body is into 17 different parts, okay? And so you can see those 17 different parts in kind of the figure on the right. And so the first figure, the one on the left, is kind of the parts on kind of a typical human frame. And then the one on the right is, you know, I showed this to my wife. My wife is an artist, and so she thought that was kind of like an artist model, but it's just, you know, you replace the body parts with just ovals and squares and stuff, just so it's a little bit easier to draw, right? And so, you know, this is kind of the first breakdown, because you know, from your whole human body here, you know, you can break that up into all these different parts. And this is really helpful, and this is kind of a set. Or this is kind of a way of modeling that we'll return to a lot, because if you'll notice that all the breaks in this figure right here refer to kind of the major joints in your body. So you have kind of a break here at the elbow joint, you have a break here at the shoulder joint, at the wrist, kind of halfway through the torso. Well, you don't really have a joint there, but at the hip joint, the knee joint, the ankle joint, you know, the neck. And so, you know, most of the major joints in the body, you know, this kind of breaks it down in terms of that. Okay. And when we go on later on in the semester to describe movement and kinematics and dynamics and things like that, you know, a lot of times we'll be talking about these major joints. And so, you know, having just an intuition in terms of how the body is broken down into these different parts is going to be really useful. Okay. Okay. So here are the 17 parts and kind of their most common names. And so, you know, even without this figure, you probably could figure out, you know, what all of these are. But I think kind of the most relevant piece of information here is that the numbering starts at the pelvis. And so that is segment number 1. Okay. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is that, you know, if you took a typical human body and you measured where the center of mass in that body is, it's usually kind of around near the pelvis. It's not really at your center. It's kind of on the lower side because your lower body tends to have a little bit more mass than your upper body. And so, we numbered the pelvis segment 1 to kind of indicate that that's where the center of mass is. Okay. And then from there, you can kind of number it kind of however you want. This person or the system that I use here, kind of as you get kind of further and further away from the pelvis, you use kind of higher and higher numbers. And so, the lower number 2 is kind of the midriff. That's kind of where your tummy is. Number 3 is where your chest is. And then you go into the arm, upper arm, lower arm, hand, left and right side. We have the neck, the head, and then your leg as well, upper leg, lower leg, and at the foot. Okay. And so, the exact numbering is, besides number 1, is not that important. I think what's kind of more important here is kind of saying that, each arm has 3 segments, each leg has 3 segments, your torso has 3 segments. The only part of your body that doesn't have 3 is just your head. So it's just your neck and your head. Okay. Okay. And then if you wanted to get more detailed, each of those different segments of the body has a more detailed way to kind of model their different parts. And so, we're not going to get into too much detail for this right now. We'll save this when we talk about upper body and lower body, all the different parts of the body in more detail. But for example, if you look at your neck, you can break that down into the different vertebrate bones inside your neck, right? So we have each of the different vertebrate bones that are stacked up, B2C7, B3C6, all the way up to B8C1, B9 being your head, okay? And then this is kind of a figure of your hand, or your fingers, I should say. Your thumb's not there, obviously. Or it is there, sorry, I miscounted. And these are all the different bones in your hand, okay? But, each of those bones has a very long name. But just know that, it's more than just this, but you can break it down into as much detail as you want. But as a starting point, we'll start here with the major sections of the body and then kind of work our way to more detail, okay? All right, any questions on this so far? Okay. Pretty straightforward, I think. Check Zoom. Okay, good. Okay. Next thing we're going to go over is position and direction terminology. Okay. And so this terminology is really helpful because beyond the major segments of the body, oftentimes you want to kind of pinpoint a specific location in the body itself. Okay. And so maybe, you're looking at something in the upper arm, but, you want to do something that's kind of the upper part of the upper arm. And so having more terms for the position and direction is really helpful. Okay. All right. And so with this, it's really helpful to have kind of a Cartesian coordinate system to kind of be centered on the body. So you can see here we have an XYZ coordinate system where the origin of the coordinate system is in the pelvis, which is where the center of mass is. And then we have, the z-axis, the y-axis, and the x-axis. X-axis pointing to the front, y-axis pointing, to the left of the person, and the z-axis pointing directly up. Okay. All right. And so that axis system will be helpful because we're going to define something what's called the principal planes of the person's body. Okay. Okay. And so these are the principal planes. And so we have 3 planes that divide the body in halves. Okay. And so there's 3 ways you can kind of split a body so that you'd have almost an equal amount of mass in the front of the plane and behind the plane. Okay. And we call these 3 planes the coronal plane, the transverse plane, and the sagittal plane. Okay. And so the coronal plane is the first plane that you look at, and so that is also known as the frontal plane. Okay. And so what that does is that splits the body into a front section and a back section. Okay. And so imagine that you have a plane that kind of splits your head kind of like this, and it goes kind of all the way down like that. Okay. And so just know that it splits into a front half and a back half. And oftentimes we call the front section the anterior side, and then the rear section we call that the posterior side. Okay. So coronal plane splits you into an anterior section and a posterior section. Okay. Okay. Next, we have the transverse plane. And so the transverse plane is kind of a horizontal plane that kind of splits you right at the pelvis. Okay. And that splits you into an upper section and a lower section. Okay. And so for the transverse plane, the way I kind of remember that is that if you kind of remember all those old videos of magicians sawing people in half, they usually saw you in half right at the transverse planes. They've been upper part and lower part. Okay. All right. So that's the second plane. And so if you go back to our typical Cartesian coordinate system, that refers to the XY plane. Okay. And then the last principal plane is the sagittal plane. And so that is the XZ plane. And so that kind of, splits you right down between your eyes, right down your nose. Okay. And so what that does is that it splits your body into a left section and a right section. Okay. So these planes are really useful, when you're looking at X-rays and CT scans. Okay. And so are you guys familiar with what a CT scan is? So CT scan is basically like a three-dimensional X-ray. So you kind of lay on a bed, you go sit in a tube, and then the X-ray goes around you. And then what you kind of get from that is kind of almost like a three-dimensional X-ray of your body. And so the way that they describe, or the way you kind of view those CT scans is usually through these planes. And so, if you've ever had a CT scan before and you've looked at them with the doctor, the doctor probably used these terms, probably not knowing that you had no idea what the terms meant, but that's what they did. And so next time you ever get a CT scan, you can kind of show off to your doctor that kind of what these terms mean. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Oops. Okay. Next, let's talk about reference configurations. And so, we're not really going to use this until we get, really into human motion in the second half of the class. But a lot of times it's really helpful to kind of create a local coordinate system. Okay. And so we just finished talking about, when you're talking about the entire body, the center or the origin of the coordinate system is usually placed at your pelvis, right? But oftentimes, when you're talking about motion of specific parts of the body, like maybe you're just looking at the motion of your arm, or maybe you're looking at the motion of your leg, it's actually helpful to put a coordinate system on each of those parts. Okay. Then as your body goes through motion, you can measure kind of the relative orientation of those different coordinate systems. And that's actually kind of the standard way to measure motion and to keep track of motion kinematics. Okay. All right. And so, when you place these local coordinate systems on all the different parts of the body, there's a certain configuration that you can stand where all of the axes are perfectly parallel, right? And so if you look at this figure right here, I forgot that I don't have a pen right now. But if you look at this configuration right here on the left with Y8, Z8, Y3, Z3, if you look at all of the Z axes on this figure, you can see that they're all parallel to each other, right? So they're all pointing straight up. And same thing with the Y axis. So all the Y axes are pointing perfectly to the left, okay? And so when you position your body in such a way where all these local coordinate systems, they're perfectly parallel to each other, we call this a reference configuration, okay? And so I give you two examples here. And so on the left here, we have kind of a reference configuration with someone standing. And so usually, the reference configuration is just chosen to be, when a person's standing up straight. And then we have another reference configuration where a person's sitting down, just like that. Okay. Slightly less comfortable, but, still useful. Okay. And again, so, we're not going to really see this until kind of the second half of the class. But what we'll see later on, we're going to talk about motion capture a lot later on in the class, and how motion capture is used to measure motion kinematics. Okay, and this notion of reference configuration is going to be helpful for that. Okay? But since we're on the topic of the different planes of the human body and coordinate systems, I thought I'd kind of show you this here. Okay. Okay. All right, so next, let's talk about relative positional terminology, okay? And so, now that we kind of have this idea of the different planes of the human body, we can kind of describe where certain parts of the body are positioned relative to each other, okay? And so there are 8 kind of important relative terms to know, okay? And they all come in pairs, and so there are 4 pairs of terms, okay? And so they all describe kind of a different position. Okay. So let's look at the first pair first. And so the first pair is superior and inferior. Okay? And so when you talk about a body part being superior to another one, that means it's closer to the head. Okay. And so, for instance, if you were to describe the location of your chest relative to your legs, right, you would say that your chest is superior to your legs because your chest is closer to your head. Okay. And of course, the opposite of this is inferior. And so, the opposite would be true. And so, if you were to describe the location of your pelvis relative to your shoulder, right? And so you would say your pelvis is inferior to your shoulder. Okay. Okay. So that's superior and inferior. And so I think that one's relatively, straightforward to know, just because the head's the top of your body, your feet's the bottom, and just, you describe things relative to that. Okay. Next, we have anterior and posterior. Okay. So anterior means towards the front of the body, and posterior means towards the back. Okay. And so, this is really useful, when you're describing the body in certain kinds of configurations, right? And so let's say that you're, well, this is not as helpful for you Zoom people, but let's say that you kind of hold your hand out in front of you like this. I guess you can't really see me on Zoom, right? You would say that your hand right now is anterior to your torso because it's in front of your body. Okay. And so, when we talk about, someone running or someone walking, we would describe, their hand going from an anterior position to a posterior position as they go through different phases of the walk cycle. Okay. Okay, so that's anterior and posterior, front and back, right? All right, the next pair of terms that we have is proximal and distal. And so these ones are a little bit less common. And so proximal means that it's something closer to your torso, and distal means it's away from your torso, okay? Right, and so I think the best example that I can give for this is usually this is used to describe injuries on your arms and your legs, okay? And so let's say that you're playing soccer and then someone gives you a dead leg, right? So someone knees you right in the thigh and you have a big bruise on your thigh, right? And so the medic comes out and then, the medic's writing his notes as to the location of your bruise. And what they would say is that your bruise, which is kind of on the middle of your thigh, is proximal to the knee, right? And so if you look at the position of your knee, right? And if you look at the position of your thigh, right, your thigh is closer to your torso than your knee, and so they would say the injury is proximal to the knee. Okay. And then same thing for distal, right? So let's say that you have an injury on your lower leg, right? So let's say that you have a cramp in your calves. They would say that the cramp is occurring in a location that's distal to the knee. All right, so that's proximal and distal. And then the last two terms that we have here are medial and lateral. So medial means it's towards the midline of the body, and lateral means it's away from the body. Okay. Okay. So kind of the important things with these terms are that, it's important to know that these are relative terms. And so when you're using these terms, you're always kind of comparing two different things, right? And so it doesn't really make a lot of sense to say that the hand is distal, right? That statement by itself means nothing because you have to compare. You have to say that the hand is more distal than something else, right? So we would say the hand is more distal than the elbow, right? Because it's further away from your torso generally. But by itself, the hand is not just distal, right? It has to be more distal than something else. And so when you're using these terms, you have to always think that you're kind of combining two things at the same time. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Check Zoom. Questions on Zoom? Question. So right and left is the opposite side. Yes. Yeah. So your right side is the right side of your body, and left. That the right and left is for the person itself, not the person looking at you. Yeah. And then another question from Zoom: how are body positions labeled with respect to each other? Yeah, that's a good question. So body positions themselves, there's countless different body positions possible out there. And so each one is kind of described kind of on its own. So that's kind of a topic that we'll cover a lot more later on. But I think for now, we'll just focus on just the terminology, and then we'll get to body positions kind of in future lectures. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about movement now. And so this is going to be relevant when we talk about muscles, which is going to be a big part of the first half of the course. Okay. And so whenever you use your muscles to move a part of your body, we have terms that we can use to describe that movement. Okay. And so it's interesting because recently, over the last 6 months, my friends have really got into working out lately. So and so they're using all these terms, to describe movement. And I'm like, yeah, I know those terms. I teach a class in biomechanics. They're like, what? It's like, I thought these were gym terms. Like, no, they're biomechanics terms, man. All right, but when we're talking about muscle movement, we often like to use these terms because they describe what kind of motion is happening. Okay, and so the most common terms that we'll use is flexion and extension, and just like all the terms that we saw on the previous slide, these two terms are kind of opposite of each other. Okay. And so flexion, what that means is that this is a type of movement that kind of reduces a body angle in your body. Okay, and so here I have the head as kind of an example, although I think the arm is kind of a better example for this. And so when you flex at your head, if you kind of imagine, you have one line that's going through your head and another line that's going through your chest, right? When you flex at your neck, you're making that angle smaller, whereas if you are extending, you're making that angle bigger. Okay. I think it's a little bit easier to see with the arm because the arm naturally is more of a looks more like a line, right? And so when you flex at your elbow, you can see that the angle between the two parts of your arm are getting smaller, right? So that's what it means to kind of flex at a joint. And when you extend, you're making that angle larger. Okay. So I think this figure here on the bottom right with the arm, that is probably the easiest way to look at this. Okay. All right. And so I have an additional note here because most everyone here is coming from a solid mechanics background just by being mechanical engineers. So when we say extension, we don't actually mean that the limb is actually getting longer, right? And so it's not the same as elongation. So extension, all that means is that the limb is straightening out, but your bones or your muscles themselves are not actually physically getting longer, which is sometimes what we think of when we think of extension as mechanical engineers, but we're thinking just in terms of the angle. That's kind of what's extended here. Okay. All right, so that's the most common terms, and in fact, most of the movements in the body you can describe as either flexion or extension. But for certain other parts of the body, we have more specialized terms to kind of describe their movement. Okay. Okay. And so for a joint that can rotate like your neck, okay, we have a movement called lateral bending, where you kind of bend over to the side. Okay, and we have rotation, which means you can kind of twist your neck. Okay. We have specialized terms for the arm or rotation at the shoulder, because the shoulder is a very interesting joint. Okay, and so when you kind of twist such that your arm or your hand comes upward, we call that supination. And then when you twist your shoulder such that your hand is facing downwards, we call that pronation. Okay, so supination, hand up; pronation, hand down. Okay, so I have a way to kind of remember this, which unfortunately only works for one of these. Is that supination? You can think of it like you're turning your hand up to hold a bowl of soup, right? So if you're to hold a bowl of soup, you need to have your palm upwards like this. So that's called supination. And then pronation, I don't have a gimmick for that. Pronation is just the opposite of supination. That's what I remember. Okay. Okay. And so if you're in lower body, we have adduction and abduction. Okay. So adduction means you're bringing your leg kind of closer to your midline. Okay. And so you can see from this figure here, the leg is coming from outwards in, and then abduction is the opposite. So abduction, you take your leg and kind of swing it outwards. Okay. So adduction and abduction. Okay. This one's really hard to see. But it kind of is describing the where your toes are pointed. Okay, and so varus configuration is when your toes are pointed inwards, and so that's kind of what's kind of happening here. That's kind of what they're describing. I don't know why this figure is viewed from the front, because it's almost impossible to view. And then valgus is when you point your toes outwards. Okay, so varus and valgus. Okay, varus toes inwards, valgus toes outwards. Okay. Okay. More motion at the feet because you know, your ankle. We'll talk about this later. Your ankle is one of the most commonly injured joints in the body, especially if you play sports. You probably sprained your ankle, you know, at least once or twice, you know, throughout your life. So we have plantar flexion. So plantar flexion means you're pointing your toes towards the ground. Okay. And that gets its name because you're planting your toes into the ground. Okay. And then we have dorsiflexion, which means when you flex at your ankle and you point your toes towards the sky. Okay, so plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Those two are opposites of each other. Okay. Okay, and then we have eversion and inversion. So I call these the ankle breaking movements. And so this is usually what happens when you break your ankle. And so we have eversion, which is when you kind of you kind of bend your ankle kind of laterally outwards, and then inversion where you bend it inwards. Okay. So an inversion ankle sprain is probably the most common type of injury that's in sports. That one's not as bad. An eversion ankle sprain is very, very painful. That's one that you don't want to have happen to you. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that's the last one. Yeah. All right. Any questions on the movement terminologies here? Okay. Let me check Zoom. All right, question. So for flexion extension, the angle is measured with respect to what? Increasing the angle on one side of the joint implies reducing the angle on the opposite side. Yeah, that's a great observation. So let me go back to that. Figure here. Yeah. So the question on Zoom was that, you know, when you describe flexion and extension, you know, one way to describe flexion is that this angle right here, you know, on the inside, on the inner part of the body, you know, that angle is getting smaller. But if you measure the angle relative to the outside, you know, that angle is actually getting bigger, right? And so, you know, for how we describe these angles, you know, they're described relative actually to the reference configuration from before. So I think let me go back up here. Okay. And so when we talked about these reference configurations in terms of the relative, you know, orientations of the coordinate axes. So when you put a coordinate system on each of the different parts of the body and you describe kind of the angles in between those, you know, a lot of times those angles are placed kind of on the inside of your, you know, on the inside of your muscle. Yeah, or the inside of the joint. And so, you know, when you look at flexion and extension, you know, then that's how the ankles are defined. Okay. Or, you know, you can put it another way where, you know, we have these terms for flexion and extension, you know, and you know, you can also say that we describe the body angle such that, you know, these terms are always true. And so we measure this angle for the elbow because when we flex at the elbow, that's what causes that ankle to get smaller. Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. It's fairly, you know, when you first look at it, it's fairly arbitrary, but you know, it's all defined in a consistent way so that, you know, when you flex, the kind of the default angle gets smaller, and when you extend, that default angle gets bigger. But you know, you can also look at it as the opposite angles as well. Yeah, good observation. All right, any other questions on this? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about skeletal anatomy now. And so, you know, just like, you know, well, you've seen before that all the bones in your body have a specific name, just so that we can refer to them, you know, systematically. Okay. You know, unfortunately, you know, there are way too many bones in the body for us to memorize. And, you know, at the end of the day, this is not an anatomy class. This is biomechanics. And so for this class, you know, what's kind of most important is that we kind of know the names of the major, I call them the major bones of the body. Okay. So this figure here does a decent job. It doesn't have all the bones that I would like, but it does have most of them. Okay. And so let's start with the pelvis, because that's kind of where the centroid is. And so kind of this kind of heart-shaped bone right here is known as your ilium. Okay. I think people generally call your pelvic bone. Okay. And your tailbone is kind of this little drill thing that's right there. Okay. Of course, you have your ribs. Okay, your rib bones are here. It's not labeled in here, but you know, I think everyone knows where your ribs are. And then the bone that kind of connects the two sides of your ribs right down the middle, that is your sternum. Okay. Okay. So now let's look at the bones in your arm. Okay. So starting from the top here, we have your clavicle. So your clavicle, you can actually feel it. And so if you kind of feel kind of at the top of your chest, you know, that bone that kind of is relatively exposed is your clavicle. Okay. The clavicle is interesting. So it is a very commonly injured bone because it is so exposed, right? And so compared to most of the bones in your body, you know, you can really feel kind of the length of the clavicle, you know, as you run your finger across your chest, right? And so it has very little protection compared to a lot of the other bones. So if you're struck kind of in your upper chest by an object, you know, a lot of times your clavicle gets fractured, and that's one of the most commonly fractured bones in the body. Okay. Okay, going into your arm, you have one bone. You have one long bone in your upper arm that is the humerus. Okay. In your lower arm, you have two bones that are kind of side by side with each other that kind of mate together, and we call those the radius and the ulna. Okay. So it's a little bit hard to tell from this figure, but the ulna is a little bit bigger than the radius. The radius is kind of the smaller bone, and the ulna is kind of the bigger one. Okay. Okay, and then your hand, and so that's not labeled here, but in your hand we have your carpals, and so your carpals are kind of the bones that are in your hand, and then we have the metacarpals, which are the bones in your fingers. Okay. Right. And so there's actually quite a lot of bones in your hand and your fingers. And so, you know, we're not going to get into all those little bones, but, you know, they all have their names. Okay. And of course, you know, you have humerus and ulna and radius and carpals on both your left and right side. You know, they're mostly the same. Right. Okay. Next, we have your skull. And so we have your skull bones at the top. And so we'll talk about this a bit later, but your skull is actually not all one part. It's actually comprised of a lot of other bones, a lot of smaller bones that kind of overlap each other. Okay? Even though I think in a lot of Halloween art, you know, the skull is depicted as one, but in reality, it's actually, you know, several pieces. Okay? All right. Next, we have your vertebrae. So the vertebrae is not labeled here, but the vertebrae is your spine, basically. Okay? So your vertebrae is interesting because it's comprised of, you know, lots of smaller bones kind of stacked on top of each other, and they're stacked in a way such that you can kind of like bend and have flexibility in your back. Okay. We're going to talk about the vertebrae a lot. So we have one whole week that's dedicated to the spine and the back and posture and, you know, all the problems that older people go through because their backs are not as strong. Okay. Okay. And then we have the bones in your legs. And so we have the femur. And so the femur is your thigh bone. And so actually, if you look at the anatomy of your arms and your legs, they're similar. And because the upper arm has one large bone, and same thing with your upper leg. So your upper leg has one large bone called the femur. Okay. And then in your lower leg, you have two bones that are kind of parallel to each other. So we have the tibia, which is the bigger bone, and the fibula, which is the smaller bone. Okay. All right. And then the last bone that I'll mention today is the kneecap, which is your patella bone. So the patella bone is the cap on your knee, which you can kind of feel if you kind of like, you know, touch your knee. Okay. And so that's all I want to mention about bones for now. You know, of course, there's lots of smaller bones, and even the parts of the bones that we talked about today, you know, they have more specific names. But I think it's more important just for now, just to, you know, have just the names of these major bones. Okay. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Is there a reason why the forearm is separated into two bones, or is that just how it is?
Yeah, that's a good question. So and so it has a little bit to do with how the joints are formed. And so your lower arm connects to two joints. So it connects to your elbow joint, it connects to your wrist joint. And so the bigger bone, the ulna, you know, that kind of forms a bigger surface with your elbow, and then the radius forms a bigger surface with your wrist. And so, you know, just kind of how the bones are shaped, you know, it has kind of a bigger end on one end and a smaller end on the other. So yeah, doesn't really answer your question, but that's kind of how they've been designed. Yeah. Same thing with the lower leg. So for the tibia, you know, it has kind of almost like a plateau surface. It forms with your knee, whereas the fibula connects more with your ankle. why that was chosen as the design for the human body? That's an excellent question. I'll have to learn from evolution. It does give advantages in terms of muscle attachments, and so the muscles that are in your forearm and your lower leg, you know, they just have more places to attach to because they have two bones, and so it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of that as well. Any other questions on skeletal anatomy? Okay. Check the Zoom. Sorry, Zoom people, I don't have access to the chat while I'm doing this. Okay, good. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of large bones. And so I'm only going to go over this briefly for now, just because we're going to go over it in more detail next week. I think next week we actually do go over bones. Yeah, we do. So next week, we'll talk in a lot more detail about bone biomechanics. But just to kind of prime you, a lot of the large bones in your body have a very similar structure. Okay? And so these are usually your upper leg, your upper arm bone, your humerus, your femur, as well as your lower lower leg, lower arm bones. Okay? And so all of these bones are kind of cylindrical in structure, so they're longer than they are wide. Okay. And so the shaft parts of these bones are known as the diaphysis, and the rounded ends are called the epiphysis. I always struggle to pronounce those words. All right. And so they each have different material properties to kind of help you help the bones do its job. Okay. And so of course you would expect these bones to be very hard, to have a lot of strength, but you'll be surprised actually. So these bones need to have a lot of flexibility too. So there's a difference between spongy bone and hard bone. And so we'll talk about those differences next week. Okay. Okay. And so the epiphysis, which is the ends of these bones, those are usually where the ligaments and tendons connect, which connects them to other bones and other muscles. Okay. We'll go over this in much more detail next week. So I don't want to linger on this for too long. Okay. So here is the skeletal bone anatomy, and so just like I mentioned, your skull is comprised of several different bones. Okay. And the reason for this is that bones themselves they don't grow all that much. And so when you're a baby and you grow to be an adult, there needs to be some flexibility of your in your skull to kind of grow. Okay. And so these are all the different bones in the skull. And so they're kind of labeled in terms of where they are kind of located. So we have the occipital bone in the back, the parietal bone is kind of on the top, the frontal bone is kind of where your forehead is. Okay. The orbit is where your eye socket goes. And then you have these two bones kind of near your ears. We have the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone. Okay. And of course, you have your mandible, which is your jawbone. Okay. Right. And so even though these are all different bones, they're knitted together pretty well. And so, if you look at a skull just by itself, you're not going to see these kind of line breaks as they are here. So here they're a lot more exaggerated, but those are separate bones in your skull. And then we have the spine. Okay? So the spine is very interesting. So and we're going to spend a lot of time on it because a lot of biomechanics is dedicated to spine and back. Okay, but your spine is separated into different segments. Okay, and so going from the top to the bottom, we have the cervical spine. So that's kind of the spine that's inside your neck. We have the thoracic spine. So that's the spine that's right behind your chest. We have the lumbar spine, which is your lower back, which is the most common place of injury. And then we have the sacrum, which is your tailbone, basically, so at the very bottom of the spine. Okay. And so, like I mentioned before, your vertebrate or your spine bones are all kind of stacked on top of each other. Kind of as you can see here on the figure on the right. Okay. And we'll talk a lot more about kind of the specific structure of the spine bones, why they have that structure and how that helps them kind of do their job. Okay. So before we get into joints, are there any final questions on skeletal anatomy here? Okay. All right, let me check Zoom. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about joints. And so the joints are described as the intersection between the major segments of your body. Okay, and a lot of times we describe the joints in terms of the type of motion they can allow. Okay, and so if you look at the different joints in your body, they all have different types of movement. Okay? So if you look at the type of movement that's available at your elbow, that's very different than the type of movement that's available at your shoulder. Okay, so some joints are more, we call them more stiff than others because they allow more degrees of freedom than the other. Okay. So there are three, I would say, main types of joints. And there are subcategories for these that we'll go over later in the class as well. But kind of as an initial discussion, I think having these three types is kind of useful. And so the first type of joint, and the one that probably we're most familiar with as engineers, is a hinge joint. And so a hinge joint only allows one rotational degree of freedom. So you can only basically rotate around one axis. Okay. And so the most common examples of this are your elbow. Okay, so your elbow can only rotate around one axis, as well as your knee. Okay, so those are kind of the most common hinge joints in your body. Okay, we'll spend a lot of time on that initially, just because hinge joints are fairly simple compared to the other joints. Okay, we have slider joints, and so slider joints only allow translational degrees of freedom. Okay. So these are not that common, and so these are not the joints that you typically associate with movement of your body, because translational degree of freedom is not that common in your body. Okay, but you mostly see these between a lot of the small bones in your hand and your feet. Okay, and so a lot of those bones just kind of slide past each other. Oh, in your ribs as well. And so a lot of those bones kind of slide past each other just to give them some flexibility in terms of your movement. And so those are the slider joints. Okay. And the third major joint type is the ball and socket joint. And so these are the most flexible joints. Okay. And so they allow basically, not completely, but almost 3 rotational degrees of freedom. Okay. And so these are the most flexible joints. So they allow kind of the most degrees of freedom. Okay. And so the two most common examples of this are your shoulder. Okay. So if your shoulder can rotate in all different directions. Okay. As well as your hip joint. And so if you move at your hip, that is also ball and socket joint. Okay, so the joint between your thigh and your pelvis, basically, that's your hip joint. Okay. Okay. And so what's interesting is that there is a relationship between how much movement that you can have at the joint and how often you get injured there, right? So generally speaking, the more movement that's allowed at the joint, the more often you can get injured there, just because it allows more movement. Okay? So for example, your shoulder joint is probably the most commonly dislocated joint in your body because it allows so much movement. It's actually very easy to dislocate. And some people actually have the talent where they can kind of dislocate their shoulder at will and then pop it back in, which is really gross, but some people can do that. Okay. And that's kind of a result of your shoulder allowing a lot of movement. Okay. And the reason some people can do that and not others is that the amount of stability or the amount of strength that you have at the joint varies kind of person to person because it depends on the exact shape of your bones and the exact shape of your tendons and your ligaments in that area as well. Okay. And like I mentioned, these are kind of a good starting point for describing the major joints, but there are much, each of these has subcategories as well. Okay, because your shoulder joint is not exactly the same as your hip joint. Your elbow is not exactly the same as your knee joint as well. Okay, so we'll definitely talk a lot more about that as the class goes on. Right. All right. Any questions on joints? Okay. Okay. So let's talk about muscles now. Okay. So muscles we're going to spend, we're going to focus on muscles, mostly on the first half of the class. Muscles are basically any tissue in your body that can produce movement. Okay. And there are 3 types of muscles. We're mostly going to focus on skeletal muscles, but it's useful to know the other types of muscles as well, right? And these are mostly, the reason we have these categories is because their structure on the inside is a lot different. Okay. And so the first type of muscle is your cardiac muscle. So those are the muscles inside your heart. Okay. So these are very specific muscles. You don't see cardiac muscles anywhere else in the body, because they have to be, they have to be able to, continuously act, without any rest, basically, right? Because if your heart ever rests, then you're dead, right? And so your cardiac muscles are designed for long, very very long, motion. They have a lot of endurance, but they also are, a type of muscle that can't be directly controlled. So you can't tell your brain, can't use your brain to tell your heart to beat faster or slowly. Okay. They can be indirectly controlled, right? And so when you're nervous or when you're exercising, your heart, of course, will beat faster, but that's not a direct, that's not direct control from your brain. Okay. All right. The second type of muscle is a smooth muscle, and so these are the muscles that line the insides of your organs, like your intestines, your lung, your bladder, and your blood vessels. Okay. And so these types of muscles are used to kind of control those organs to a certain degree. Okay. You also cannot directly control these muscles, but again, the same with cardiac muscles, they do respond to hormones and other activity in your body. Okay. All right. And so the last type of muscle that there is skeletal muscles. And so these are the muscles that we can actually voluntarily control. Okay. So these are the muscles that actually cause movement of your bones and your human frame. Okay. And they connect to your bones. And so that's why they're called skeletal muscles. Okay. Okay. And so what's interesting about muscles is that, they can contract and they can shorten, but the muscles actually don't have the ability to lengthen on their own. Okay. And so what we'll see kind of later on is that, almost all the muscles in your body, actually all the muscles in your body, your skeletal muscles become in pairs, right? And so, I think the most common example of this is your bicep and your tricep, right? And so if you use your bicep to kind of flex your elbow, right? If you wanted to extend your elbow, your bicep can't do that. Your bicep can't extend your elbow. The opposite muscle on the other side of your arm, your triceps, are responsible for that, right? So your biceps curl, your triceps extend. Okay. And it's kind of a fun thing to do. And so, you can try to control your muscles, using your other hand. And so to flex your elbow, you kind of pinch your biceps with your other hand. Okay. And that'll pull your arm towards you. And then you control the extension by pinching your triceps. Okay. So kind of a fun thing to do. Okay. Okay. So that's all I want to say about muscles for now, just because we're definitely going to be talking a lot about muscles over the next few weeks. So we'll definitely be familiar with muscles then. Okay. Any questions on muscles? Oops. I'm aware that this person on the right has a butt, and so we'll go ahead and move on from that. Okay. All right. And so the last thing I want to go over today is this idea of anthropomorphic data. Okay. And so anthropomorphic data, what this refers to are the sizes of all the different parts of your body. Okay. And so the length of your torso, the length of your arms, the different angles of the body and things like that. Okay. Because when we're doing analysis for all of the different body parts, a lot of times we have to insert numbers into our equations, right? We have to insert numbers for, the mass of the arm, the length of the arm, same thing for the leg and all that stuff. Okay. But what's interesting about, the human body is that there's a huge variety of these numbers, right? So no two people are the same. So no two people have, the exact same length of the arms, the exact same length of the legs, and so on and so forth, right? And so when you're doing these calculations, a lot of the times it can be really difficult to know, what to plug into these equations, right? And so, when you're designing devices or when you're designing things for, for humans to use, oftentimes you need to plug in some data into your equations, into your analysis in order to make it useful. Okay. And so that's where anthropomorphic data comes in. And so, this is data that's been collected, it's continuously being collected on humans. Okay. And you can use it to insert into your equations. Okay. And what you'll notice from these measurements is that they're all measured usually relative to the same location. Okay. And so if we look at the anthropomorphic data of someone standing up, you can see here that the location of the top of the head, the location of the eyes, of the shoulders, of the waist, and the butt, right? These are all measured relative to the ground, okay? And so when you look up data on these in a table or from a database, you know, they'll usually just give you the measurements for A, B, C, D, and E, okay? And so, you know, it's up to you to kind of know that, you know, that's what these are referring to, okay? And if you look at the measurements of someone sitting down, you can see they're all measured kind of relative to different parts, okay? And if we go to the next page, you know, we can see a bit more of a detailed view, okay? And so you can see here that, you know, let's look at A, right? So A is height, right? And so you can see here that we have the anthropomorphic data broken down by gender as well as percentile, right? And so if you are, let's see, I believe this is in meters. And so if you are 1.76 meters high, you are right at the average of males for height, okay? And the average height for females is 1.618 meters, okay? But if you're taller than 1.869 meters, then you are in the 95th percentile. That means you are, you know, taller than 95% of humans, or 95% of males. And then for females, that is 1.724, okay? And of course, there's the other side. So you have 1.649. So if you're shorter than that, then you are the bottom 5%. So that's me. I'm really short. And then for females, if you're less than 1.518 meters, then you're, you know, bottom 5. Okay. And so if you're interested, so I you know, when I first saw this, you know, I found it really interesting to kind of see this data and to kind of measure myself, you know, to see kind of where I stand on all these things. And so, you know, I don't know why I did, because, you know, for me, I'm kind of here on everything because I'm very small. But I blame my parents because they're both small. Okay. And then down here, you can see the data for sitting as well. Okay. Okay. All right. And so, you know, of course, we're not going to go through all these numbers, but, you know, they're there for your, you know, for your interest. And so that's about it for today. And so, you know, it's kind of a, you know, a blitz of different terminologies. We ended a little bit early, kind of just as I predicted. But are there any final questions on anatomy before we sign off for this week? Okay. All right. So that's all I got for this week, guys. So hope you guys have a good weekend. We might change rooms next week, so keep an eye out for an email from me, just in terms of, you know, in case we need a bigger room. But, you know, I'll let you guys know before Monday. Okay. So thank you guys for coming today. I hope you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Hey.
So I wanted to know whether I can get up the wait list on the first time.
Yeah. So I do plan on adding everyone from the wait list. We just might have to get a bigger room. That's what I said. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure.
That's flexibility, but there's also manipulation.
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah, so actually those are, when you talk about flexibility and mobility, that's actually more at your joints more than your muscles themselves. And so, you know, the more flexible you are at your, you know, people think of that as your muscles, but that's more just how your joints are. Because, you know, when you talk about flexibility or mobility, it's how much range of motion you have in your joints. Some people, their bones are designed in a way where they can't, you know, they can't bend as much. That's more at their joints more so than their muscles. Okay. Yeah.
I always hear about a lot because actually right after this class, I do kickboxing.
Oh yeah,
so,
nice.
For joints, I get to do a lot of locks. So
Nice.
I always hear about that.
I see.
So I was wondering.
Cool. Nice.
Thank you.
Yep.
My name is Sam. I just wanted to introduce myself
Okay,
because
cool.
I don't know if I'm going to make it to office hours necessarily.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm a grad student. I wanted to ask, like, when the do you have any like suggestions as to where I might be able to find the like paper or like?
Yeah. So for the literature search, you know, what I usually ask, you know, is there an area of biomechanics that you're really interested in?
Right now, not necessarily everything sort of like interests me.
Sure, yeah.
I'm sort of like, I don't know, I'm very flip-floppy on what I want, like career-wise.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
wicked flip-floppy.
Uh-huh.
I want to try to do something like, that's not necessarily like aerospace, but like maybe something like that. So I'm thinking like right now during the class, it's like, okay, what if I did something like chair design?
Yeah.
Like race car chairs or like, restaurant chairs and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I feel like that might be a fun thing.
Yeah.
So that might be something that I might want to like check out and see if somebody does that. And maybe, double it, like use it for the project as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And that's, I design it in that way. So, for the grad students, for the final project anyway, you're going to be looking up papers, but then, you can use that kind of research with the final project as well. That's great actually. So yeah, there's a lot of biomechanics that goes into, race car chair design or aircraft chair design, because you got to be safe. And then even if you hit stuff, you have to be, your body has to be in a certain way where you're not going to get, totally wrecked.
Yeah. It feels like now it's statics. Yeah. Statics, not dynamics, right?
Yes. Yeah. Both, a little both actually. So
okay.
So actually, what I usually do is I have you heard of Google Scholar before?
Yes.
Okay. So what I usually do when I'm when I'm interested in learning about a topic is I go to Google Scholar and I just search up the topic that I'm interested in, and then I read some of the papers that are you can sort or you can filter in Google Scholar in terms of how many citations they have, and usually the papers with the highest amount of citations, those are usually really good, really reliable. So I would definitely go with that.
Okay, sweet. So I'll start looking that up. And yeah, I'm also commuting from Riverside, so I don't know how many in-person meetings I'm gonna make.
Okay,
so
yeah.
Want to like show my face, be like, "Hi, my name is Nava." Yeah.
So Nava, right?
Yes, Nava.
Cool. Nice to meet
Thank
you.
you, Professor
Yeah.
Tran, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I just want to let you know, my family's been planning a cruise
Okay.
for like a year and a half.
Okay.
And it's gonna be in November.
November. Okay.
Yeah, it's like the first like 10 days in November.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's an exam. during that
Let me
time.
see.
I just wanted to throw it out as early as possible.
I think there might be an exam.
Yeah, because that's the exam times for most classes.
I can have you take the, okay, so the exam is mid-November, actually.
I think I'll be back by then. I think
Okay,
I think I come back like the Friday before the 14th. I think.
okay,
I think.
okay, that's perfect. We have internet access on the cruise?
I think so.
Okay,
I'm gonna take my laptop just in case for schoolwork that some professor's like, no, you gotta do it.
yeah,
You gotta do it right now.
yeah. So I would definitely recommend, at least keeping up with the lectures while you're on the cruise.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to do that.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, and then when you come back, you can take the exam. If this does conflict with the cruise, and we can either have you take the exam before or after.
Okay.
Probably after. I think probably
Yeah,
makes more
'cause
sense.
before would be
Before would be
like
pretty
the
early.
31st.
Yeah, and we
like
probably wouldn't have covered the material yet. So probably after probably make the most sense. But yeah, thanks for letting me know before. And once you get the dates, just let me know. And then we can work some stuff.
because they haven't sent the flight information out because it leaves out of Barcelona.
Okay.
So,
Oh wow.
So
Okay.
they haven't sent the flight out yet.
I see. Okay. Yeah, just let me know, and then we can plan around it. There's probably going to be at least one homework assignment due probably the week before that too.
Okay.
And so just be aware of those deadlines.
Okay. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks.
Yep.